Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow, December 26th, 2018. Still at Leawood. And with my guy on anything having to do with Syria, Jonathan Spire. I've interviewed him before, but for those of you who are new to Rejuvenation, he is, as far as I'm concerned, like the expert on Syria. If you have any other suggestions, you're welcome to write to me. But for now, we're going to go with this. So he's also at Leawood this week and has been talking, as his position is, about the Middle East. So, Jonathan, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hello, Eve. Nice to see you again.
So, first of all, what are the reactions here to the sessions that you've been giving? Because Leawood is not known for necessarily seeing the Middle East the way you and I might see it.
Yeah, I've actually been quite generally pleasantly surprised. Otherwise, I don't think I've had any really negative responses or so. I think because, you know, to some degree, if you really just place the facts before people, you know, then and you can come at that with real intricacy and detail. I think many people who maybe just even feel a bit guilty about trying to counter that by having some sort of illusory, suggestion and so on. But the other reason I think also, frankly, is because I almost deliberately don't particularly deal with what would generally be called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because I find that there you have all these red lines and all these hot buttons and everyone knows exactly what needs to be done and everyone instantly becomes an expert and everybody suddenly knows everything about the Middle East. So I find that's fine. I actually find that an interesting and good way sometimes to educate people about the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic is actually to start with the broader region and to look at the Arab world, Arab politics, Islamist politics, maybe in contexts which people aren't so prejudiced about and don't so suddenly get all upset about. And then you can maybe suggest to them gently, well, hey, okay, if you're looking at Iraq in that way, if you think you've learned something about Syria from talking about this stuff, about the role of Islamism, about the role of political Islam, about the way in which in the Arab world, when politics goes down to street level, it's almost always political Islam that wins out. If you kind of think that's true and you found that convincing in the Syrian context, well, maybe that might also be applicable to, to thinking another way about what's happening west of the Jordan River. I'm not in business in order to do that, but I would find that that might be a useful way to approach it. In any case, talking about Syria, talking about Iraq to a Jewish audience, it's just much less emotive for people. So even with people who might have views that we would regard as naive and misguided regarding, events in Judea and Samaria or in Jerusalem, they can sometimes have at least reasoned discussion about issues and events elsewhere.
So as a former Brit, which my audience are very intelligent and they might have picked up on your accent, what's it like for you coming back specifically in England? Is it any different than anywhere else that you speak, or are you a little more in tune perhaps with the audience because you know how they're thinking and you were raised in the same kind of culture that the audience is in?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I suppose maybe I am, but it's not something I give a huge amount of thought to be honest. I mean, most of the time I find when I'm speaking in my general work to English-speaking audiences, it's quite rare for it to be people from the UK. I mean, I speak a lot, of course, to American audiences, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and for whatever reason, it's generally less to people from the UK. It's not the usual thing for me. So yeah, I mean, it's fine to do it. Of course, there's cultural, common reference points and so on. But I don't think there's anything beyond that, at least for me personally. As I haven't lived in the UK now for nearly 30 years, it's quite a long time. The UK itself has changed in that time. I've certainly changed too. So, it's not there isn't some sort of sense of a glorious homecoming or something. But on the other hand, yeah, sure, I suppose there are cultural reference points that we share. But I'm not sure if when talking about the issues which we're discussing here, whether that really comes into play. If you're talking about Syria, if you're talking about Iran, if you're talking about the Middle East, the fact that, I was born in the UK and grew up in the UK, and so to most of the folks in the audience in this event, it doesn't really impact so much on that discussion. If we were talking about the UK or talking about, culture of the UK and so on, then of course it would. But if we're talking about Syria, Iraq, Iran, and so on, less so, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So as opposed to a lot of other journalists, you actually go to the areas. When was the last time that you were anywhere near Syria?
Well, I was reporting in Iraq about 3 weeks ago. So then we were pretty close to the Syrian border at times. But the stories we were doing were not on that occasion to do with Syria, because many times I've entered Syria from Iraq. But on this occasion, it was two different stories, one of which took me actually in the opposite direction from Syria when in northern Iraq, i.e. eastwards towards the border with Iran. and that was because we were doing a story on Iranian Kurdish armed groups who are fighting against the Iranian regime. And then the other story was the attempt by ISIS to reestablish itself in parts of central Iraq. So these were two kind of Iraq/Iran centered stories. So Syria was a little bit kind of left aside on that occasion. But that was the last piece of regional reporting which I did, which has kind of given birth or led to a whole bunch of, I think, quite interesting articles coming out of that. So I'm happy with that.
Where can my audience read you?
Well, if we take that recent trip as an example, so there was two articles in a publication called Jane's Intelligence Review, which came out of that trip. One, as I said, on the Iranian Kurdish insurgency, the other on the return of ISIS to Iraq. Unfortunately, Jane's Intelligence Review, or the IHS Jane's group in general, charge quite a bit for a subscription. It's mainly sort of professionals in the defense and intelligence industries who belong to that. So probably unless your readers want to fork out around $700 for an annual membership just to read my articles, which I imagine they probably do not, that I'm afraid is not the best destination probably. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal also which came out about the ISIS stuff a couple of weeks ago, so that's findable. The easiest way to find my stuff in general, if people are interested, is just to go to my website, which is jonathanspire.com, because basically, unless there's a paywall issue, which means I can't do it, basically I put all my published articles up at that website. That's what it is. It's just an archive of published articles. So it's a good place if anybody's interested to go and take a look.
So, of course, the burning question now is Trump and the imminent, or so he says, pullout of the American troops from Syria. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have to say I was very disappointed to hear the president's announcement on December 19th, because I think many of us had the notion that the Trump administration, and indeed with I think a degree of of proof that the Trump administration was getting into the business of taking very seriously the need to contain and roll back the gains made by Iran and its allies in the region over the last decade. And there's been plenty to be encouraged in that regard. Obviously, the decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, the subsequent statement by Secretary of State Pompeo laying out 12 conditions which the Iranians would need to comply with to get themselves a new nuclear deal, and most of those conditions didn't relate to nuclear activity specifically, but rather to Iranian activity in the region. And then, of course, the subsequent reimposition of sanctions on the energy sector on November 4th. All good stuff. And there was a sense that was coming together and crystallizing the much-needed American leadership of any anti-Iran regional coalition, which would include Israel, of course, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and other players. I'm afraid that the announcement on December 19th to some degree kind of, muddies that and confuses and complicates that picture, because it is a fact, at least in my estimation, that the withdrawal of the United States forces from the 30% of Syria, which they currently kind of guarantee control of, will be and is being seen as a very major gift to Islamic Republic of Iran, to the Assad regime, of course, to Turkey also, and also to Russia. That is to say, to all the enemies of the West who are currently assembled in our neighborhood, this is kind of a free gift. Now, I get it. We shouldn't be surprised by it. It's not that President Trump is suddenly doing something that nobody could possibly have predicted he might have wanted to do. On the contrary, this is absolutely in keeping with the kind of promises he made on the campaign trail, where I'm not quoting directly, but where his general perspective on these kind of commitments was, well, we spend a great deal of money and sometimes a great deal of blood on these overseas commitments. We don't seem to get anything out of it. Nobody's grateful to us for it. Let's bring the troops home. That has a certain amount, or a lot, I think, of resonance among Trump's kind of core voting public. That's clearly the way that he looks at things. In April, he did say that the U.S. troops will be out by the end of the year, the end of 2018. So there's plenty of precedent for this. But after April, we heard a whole series of statements by National Security Advisor John Bolton and Secretary of State Pompeo again, and the Special Envoy on Syria, Jim Jeffrey, all of which seemed to indicate that actually now the U.S. had changed its view. It was folding the operation in eastern Syria into a broader anti-Iran strategy. So that now appears to have been abruptly reversed, and that's not encouraging, in my view.
So from conversations you and I have had over the years, I know that you feel a tremendous connection to the Kurds, and that one of the main issues that you have is seeing how they're getting pretty much killed by everybody, and that this is a people that like Israel, wants their own state, wants to carve out, doesn't want to hurt anybody else, is just trying to carve out a life for themselves. How do you think this is all going to affect them?
Well, I'm afraid to say that the people in Syria and Kurdistan now, obviously very upset and very worried about the future affecting them after the announcement of December 19th, because we're already seeing the massing of Turkish troops on the border close to the town of Manbij with their Syrian Sunni Arab rebel allies. We're also seeing regime forces further south coming up close to the border. So it's almost like everybody's now kind of chomping at the bit to try and come in there and take over that area that the Kurds have sort of carved out with American assistance over the last half decade, effectively. And it's a worrying thing because, there's a whole big population. There's nearly 4 million people living in that area. It's not a negligible population. And if we look at the precedent which already exists, which was the Turkish destruction in January of this year of the Afrin canton, Kurdish canton, further west, then I'm afraid it's a very worrying precedent indeed, because in that area there's been forced Islamization, there's been expulsion of people from their homes, there's been a kind of low-grade ethnic cleansing of Kurds taking place. So if that takes place on a larger scale, as may happen if the Turks come in, then that's going to be, very worrying indeed. It's also not only a question, of course, of sentiment, and as I think Henry Kissinger once famously said, foreign policy is not a school of social work, and it's not. One needs to be able to differentiate between the two. But the thing is that there is also, I think, a practical element to this, which is that the United States, like other countries, will need once again in years ahead to have allies and to work with other forces inside the region. And there is a growing sense that America is not a reliable ally. Now, that's not just a question of sentiment. That means next time you want to work with somebody, when America wants to work with somebody, that somebody may well, do their calculation and go, wait a minute, but aren't you the guys who work with people and then 6 months later leave them to be slaughtered by their enemies? Oh, well, I think I won't work with you after all. I think that Iran and Russia maybe have a better track record of, sticking with their allies, so I think I'll go and work with them. That's very bad if people start to think in those terms. That's kind of like a devaluing of what one might call the American strategic coin, strategic currency in the region, and that's not a good thing. And that's not a good thing that should happen. It's not good for the United States itself. It's not good for the West, and it's not good for Western allies in the region, such as Israel. The fact of the matter is that Israel is a very strong country. So at the end of the day, if, as appears to maybe be the case, America is kind of retreating from its role as hegemon, from its role as guarantor of Middle East security, Americans maybe no longer want to underwrite a Pax Americana, if one could put it that way, in the Middle East. And that's absolutely their right. At the end of the day, the U.S. armed forces belong to America's citizens, and they can choose to use them as they wish. If they no longer wish to play that role, then that's detrimental to U.S. allies in the region. But it's most detrimental to the weakest among U.S. allies, and least detrimental to the strongest. And Israel is perhaps the strongest American ally in the region that can say, okay, if the Americans don't want to be around here anymore, we nevertheless, most of the time, almost always, can look after our own security with our own armed forces. So it's not something terrible, but it's certainly not something to be celebrated, I would say.
So that weakening of American deterrence, though, actually started a few years ago with Obama. And so what you're saying here is that Trump is in some way continuing what Obama did here in the Middle East?
Look, Obama, of course, was the beginning of this. And with Obama, it was very clear that what Obama wanted was simply to get out of the region and leave it. As it turns out, what Obama intended to do was to increase the strength of Islamic Republic of Iran. A disastrous thought. In my estimation, but that's, I think, what he wanted to do in order to balance the Iranians against the Saudis and Israel, and then leave what he imagined would be a kind of balance of power in the region. Completely deluded, of course, but that, I think, is a fair characterization of what the Obama administration wanted to achieve in the Middle East through the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and so on and so forth. Trump, I don't think, has any ideas like that. Trump clearly does not trust Iran. Trump's instincts are good regarding Iran. But the thing is, what there does appear to be in the administration is a kind of contradiction between, on the one hand, some very, very sound strategic thinking regarding Iranian ambitions and the need to push them back, and some very, very sound strategic thinkers who, after all, only have the jobs they have because of President Trump. He doesn't have to have John Bolton as national security advisor, doesn't have to have Pompeo at state, Jim Jeffrey, and the others. He doesn't have to have those guys in their job. So they're there because Trump wants them there, and they have very sound and sensible thoughts about Iran. But what I think there is in this administration is a certain contradiction between the soundness of their analysis in that regard, but then also the thing I was talking about before, which is the other very, very strong impulse in Trump and those around him, which is, I won't say isolationism, but just a desire to end what they see as wasteful and unnecessary and costly commitments overseas that they don't see America should be getting into right now. So there's a contradiction between the two, and that leads, I think, to the kind of confusing messages that have been coming out in recent months. On the one hand, it's about, building and crafting a strategy to contain and roll back Iran, but then it's about suddenly ending commitments to allies in key geographical spots in the region. So I think there's kind of two different and indeed contradictory impulses at work in this administration. Sometimes the one wins out, sometimes the other wins out. So you kind of don't really know where you are, and that's not an ideal situation to be in.
Not in the least. Are you concerned about Russia coming in more powerfully? I mean, as Israelis, it seems that our prime minister has right now worked out some arrangement with Putin, at least to not go head to head over Syria and other Iranian-controlled areas. But what do you see happening to Russia in the future if indeed America is pulling itself out of the region more?
Well, you're right to point out that that Prime Minister Netanyahu has invested a great deal of time and effort in keeping correct relations with Russia. Since the Russian aircraft first appeared over the skies of Syria in late September 2015. And that's time well spent, without a doubt. It's not good from Israel's point of view that the Russians are back in the Eastern Mediterranean. It would be much better if they weren't. But given that they are, it's better to have decent relations with them than not. And as it turns out, there is what to work with regard to Putin. Putin evidently or clearly is not himself an anti-Semite. That's not something you can necessarily take for granted with Russian leaders, and he's not. He doesn't have, he has a certain amount, it would appear, even of warm feelings towards Israel. But the thing is, at the end of the day, Putin will follow what he regards as Russian strategic interests, and right now the Russians have been close to a strategic alliance with Iran, at least with regard to Syria, over the course of the last half decade, in terms of preserving the rule, of course, of Bashar Assad and his regime, which means that at the end of the day, the Russians don't want Israel to be carrying out what they regard as disruptive actions in the air against Iranian infrastructure in Syria, which Israel regards as absolutely essential. And this is the reason for Israeli security and for the security of Israel's citizens. And this is why, in my estimation, the Russians have chosen to kind of a little bit blow out of proportion their response to the downing of the Ilyushin 20 by Syrian air defenses following an Israeli raid into Latakia province in Syria in September of this year. They've kind of chosen to use that as a sort of scapegoat to say, okay, no, Israel cannot carry on anymore with the kind of activity that's been going on. And indeed, we have an example right up and over the last 24 hours. There was this apparent Israeli raid at targets south and southwest of Damascus last night, and we're already seeing in the last hours that the Russians are now coming out very strongly against this. There's a whole story there trying to sort of spin out and put out that Israel was the raid threatened the safety of 2 civilian flights at the time. So you can see the Russians are really trying very hard to stop Israel from doing what it needs to do. Russia is not an enemy of Israel by any means, but it is a kind of rival state in the sense it is a powerful state with a very different agenda in the region. So yes, I think we're going to have to keep on working with the Russians as best we can. We've already achieved a lot, even in spite of the Russian position. There's no doubt that the Iranians will need to feel very, very careful about using this land corridor that they've been trying to establish in Syria over the last few years. But at the same time, I'm afraid it's going to be a day-to-day effort, a day-to-day struggle to try to keep the Russians in a place where they don't start looking to actively interfere with the stuff that we need to do. It's not going to be easy.
And how about Saudi Arabia? Where do you see that? Where do you see that country in this whole picture? It's taking a bit of a hit after Khashoggi, and there's some weird stuff going on. Erdogan really played that brilliantly. Do you see them coming into some kind of void that the Americans are leaving?
The Saudis will undoubtedly be concerned about what they've just heard in Syria, but at the same time, what happens to Syrian Kurds doesn't necessarily apply to the Saudis, and I think that we can assume that the close U.S. relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, are set to continue. I mean, we know that President Trump himself, contrary to what he may now think regarding Eastern Syria, has been very vocally behind the connection to Saudi Arabia, and specifically, of course, because it's a very wealthy country and it wants to buy large amounts of American arms. So, that's something which makes sense to Trump, and he's absolutely going to be in favor of that. You're right that Erdogan played to maximum effect and benefit the apparent murder of the unfortunate journalist Jamal Khashoggi, one might also add that, the Saudi, if indeed it was an act by Saudi state agents, was cruel and also, phenomenally stupid to try and carry it out. You're going to kill this dissident and you're going to do it in your own embassy in the capital of a country that is deeply hostile to you, which the journalist in question is deeply sympathetic to, to that Turkish. It's absolutely astonishing. So this apparently happened and the Turks took full advantage of it. Yeah, I think there are indications that, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is an impulsive, he's a young guy, still in his early 30s. Same time, he is somebody who has a very serious vision for his country. The Vision 2030, he calls it, which is intended to wean Saudi Arabia from being an economy just based on petrochemicals by 2030. It's a vital task. So I think this is a serious and substantial figure. I think, in my estimation at least, the judgment of his actions in Yemen in Western media has been a little bit one-sided. Actually, there have been real achievements in Yemen as a result of the Saudi and Emirati intervention. The Iran-supported Houthis didn't reach the Bab el-Mandeb Strait down there, which would have enabled them to block maritime traffic coming up from the Gulf towards Suez Canal. So it's a strategic goal that they did achieve. So I think that the jury is still out, so to speak, regarding MBS. I think he's probably going to be an important figure for in the period to come in our region, in spite of the hit that he's taken as a result of the Khashoggi killing. And certainly from an Israeli point of view, the connections that do exist both to Saudi Arabia and to UAE and to Bahrain, maybe even to Oman now. We know nothing that was in Oman just recently. These remain still very important assets for Israel, the growing relationship with Gulf countries, which I don't think we should be underestimated.
All right, so one last question, then I've got to run to my last panel. What about Jordan? And we share, as Israelis, we share our longest border with Jordan. They have an influx, a huge influx, 1.5 million of refugees from Syria. No oil, really no natural resources, and some of the worst neighbors in the world. I mean, obviously, aside from Israel. You see anything happening with the Hashemite kingdom right now, or it's just kind of just going to make it through for the next little bit and stay under the radar?
I mean, there has been quite significant, unrest in terms of demonstrations based on economic demands inside Jordan. And Jordan is, of course, subject to an IMF bailout package, which requires the Jordanians to raise prices in a number of key areas, including fuel and bread. When these kind of things in the past have led to very serious or considerable unrest in Jordan, I think it's very possible we could be seeing more of that in the months ahead. I don't think that means that, though, that we should be thinking that, Jordan is anywhere near being in a kind of pre-revolutionary situation in which the Hashemite monarchy could fall. No, I think we're still, a considerable number of steps away from that. Jordan has difficulties, as you mentioned. It also has powerful friends. Israel, underwrites Jordanian security, and in spite of sometimes the public the public statements by Jordanian leaders critical or deeply critical of Israel, behind the scenes they know just how dependent they are on Israeli security assistance. The Americans are absolutely committed to the survival of the monarchy for similar reasons. The Gulf monarchs also, even though they've not been as generous as the Jordanians hoped in terms of coming up and putting their hand in their pocket, so to speak, to help Jordan. Should the monarchy really get into trouble, I think they would find themselves the beneficiaries of rapid Emirati and Saudi assistance. So the Jordanians have some powerful friends. As we know, the Gulf monarchies, and indeed regional monarchies in general, have come through fairly well from the last years of regional instability because of their greater legitimacy in a certain sense, often in Islamic terms and also in tribal terms. Often the king, so-called, is actually the person who's head of the biggest and most powerful tribal federation. That's a very real form of power which these families hold, so to speak. So for all those reasons, I wouldn't want to be anywhere close to eulogizing, so to speak, the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan yet. But yes, I think for economic reasons, there is going to be instability there, some instability in the period ahead.
And it looks like you're going to have a lot of work to do. You're not going to be bored at all. All right. Thank you so much, Jonathan Spyer. I'll circle back to you again in the future because, I don't know, I think my listeners would have to agree. Your analysis and the way that you present them just clears up a lot of the major mess and fog, and just nobody knows who's who, who's an ally, who's a friend, what on earth is going on in this crazy part of the world. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Eve. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, everybody, you can write to me, eve@thelandofisrael.com. That's it for now. I will be back later. Bye.
If you want to improve relations between Israel and American Jews, one of the things that you should do is encourage people to listen to the Land of Israel Network. Listen to Eve Harrow, and listen to Yishai Fleischer, and listen to Ari and Jeremy, and Shlomo Katz, and listen to Mike Foyer, and listen to Josh Haston, because the Land of Israel Network has a mission, and that's to spread love between Israel and American Jews. There's so much to love about Israel. There's so much to love about Israelis. And I think the Land of Israel Network is part of the solution. You are all part of the solution.
You're listening to the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com, broadcasting the truth and beauty of Israel to the world.